The dawn arrived in New York City on that date with a distinct clarity and stillness. However, the passage of time would reveal that by 10:28 a.m., the global landscape had undergone an irreversible transformation. 4 commercial passenger aircraft were involved. 19 individuals orchestrated their seizure. Nearly 3,000 innocent lives were tragically lost, and the aerial realm, once perceived as a symbol of human ingenuity and progress, was violently converted into a battleground. This was not a scene conjured from the realm of cinematic fiction. These were tangible airplanes, authentic passengers, genuine and profound terror that gripped the world. 2 of these aircraft struck the iconic twin towers of the World Trade Center. Another met its destructive end against the Pentagon building. The final aircraft crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, a direct consequence of the courageous resistance mounted by the passengers and crew on board. These were not military fighter jets. They were ordinary Boeing airliners, designed for civilian transportation, and they were piloted not by individuals holding professional aviation licenses, but by men who had acquired just enough rudimentary training to guide them towards their intended targets of destruction. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new here, my content focuses on exploring the most shocking and enigmatic events in the history of aviation. We've previously delved into the catastrophic failure of the Concorde and the perplexing disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. If you haven't had the chance to watch those yet, I highly recommend checking them out after this video. And if you find yourself captivated by in-depth analyses of aviation history, please consider showing your support by giving this video a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel. It truly helps me out. Today, our focus will be on examining the events of 9/11 specifically through the lens of aviation. Our aim is not simply to recount the tragic occurrences, but to understand the underlying mechanisms and circumstances that allowed them to unfold. We will explore how ordinary commercial aircraft were transformed into deadly instruments. We will analyze the systemic failures within security protocols that were exploited, and we will consider the subsequent measures and transformations that have been implemented to prevent any future recurrence of such a devastating event. The time is 8:46 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. American Airlines. Flight 11 lifts off from Logan International Airport in Boston, Massachusetts, bound for Los Angeles International Airport. It's a routine flight, indistinguishable from the thousands of others that occurred daily. However, as the aircraft ascends into the higher altitudes, 6 individuals driven by extremist ideologies and armed with simple knives and box cutters forcibly gain entry to the aircraft's cockpit. By precisely 8:46 a.m., these individuals have successfully seized control of the aircraft. This moment marks merely the beginning of a sequence of catastrophic events. 8:46 a.m. Impact at the North Tower. American Airlines Flight 11, now under the control of the hijackers, violently strikes the North Tower of the World Trade Center at its full operational speed. The global community observes with utter disbelief as a colossal fireball erupts against the backdrop of the clear morning sky. Yet, this horrific event is not an isolated incident. 8:14 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175. Concurrently, United Airlines Flight 175, also en route to Los Angeles, commences its takeoff from Boston. The individuals who have commandeered this aircraft are poised to replicate the actions of their counterparts. 9:03 a.m. Impact at the South Tower. Less than 20 minutes following the initial impact, United Airlines Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Another searing fireball, another surge of widespread panic and terror. individuals on the ground witnessed the unimaginable unfolding directly before their very eyes. 9:37 a.m. The Pentagon. At approximately the same time, American Airlines Flight 77 departs from Washington Dulles International Airport, with its intended destination being California. However, a mere 30 minutes into its flight, this aircraft, too, is seized by hijackers. These terrorists deliberately crash the airplane into the Pentagon, the very nerve center of the United States military apparatus. 9:59 a.m. Collapse of the South Tower. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, already structurally compromised and engulfed in flames from the impact of Flight 175, succumbs to the intense heat and stress. It implodes in a terrifying cascade of dust, smoke, and debris. The North Tower is not far behind in its tragic fate. 10:03 a.m. United Airlines Flight 93. Aboard United Airlines Flight 93, which had departed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey, the passengers and crew become aware of the unfolding hijackings through in-flight communications. Displaying extraordinary bravery, they collectively fight back against the terrorist hijackers. As a direct result of their heroic resistance, the aircraft crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, preventing it from reaching its intended target, believed to be either the White House or the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. However, while this unprecedented chaos unfolds in the skies above, a state of profound confusion grips those on the ground. Air traffic controllers frantically attempt to decipher the rapidly evolving and terrifying situation. Critical questions arise. Why was there such a significant delay in the directive to ground all airborne commercial flights? How were these individuals able to remain undetected within the security systems for such an extended period? Flying a commercial airliner, especially one as large and complex as the Boeing 757 or Boeing 767, is no simple feat. 1000B. These planes are built to fly long distances, carrying hundreds of passengers across vast expanses of land and ocean. They're equipped with sophisticated avionics, automated systems, and require a well-trained pilot to operate efficiently. 1000B. Typical pilot needs years of training, with thousands of hours in the cockpit and many more in flight simulators. To become a commercial pilot, you must pass rigorous tests, including practical flying experience and written exams. But the terrorists on September 11th didn't have that kind of training. 1000B. They didn't need it. In fact, they only needed to understand the basics of how to control an aircraft, just enough to take over and reach their targets. The key figure among the hijackers was Mohammed Atta. 1000B. Atta, the leader of the operation, was the most trained of the group. He attended flight schools in Germany and the United States. He had some experience in small aircraft, but that wasn't enough to prepare him for controlling a massive airliner like a 757 or 767 1000B. So how did he and his fellow hijackers manage to fly these massive planes without the necessary experience? The answer lies in flight simulators. X-1000B Atta and the other hijackers used flight simulators to learn how to operate the planes they would hijack. These simulators are the same tools that aspiring pilots use to practice and hone their skills before stepping into the cockpit of a real aircraft. X-1000B. But unlike most pilots, they weren't preparing for regular flights. They were learning only what they needed to carry out their mission: how to fly the plane long enough to crash it into a target. Mohammed Atta used a Boeing 727 flight simulator, which had a similar cockpit layout to the 747. 1000B. While the 727 is a different model, the cockpit design and the basic controls were almost identical, making it possible for Atta to get comfortable with the flight dynamics of the larger planes he would eventually hijack. X-1000B. But Atta's training didn't stop there. He also trained on flight simulator software designed to replicate the exact experience of flying a Boeing 757. X-1000B. These simulators were available for personal computers and allowed the hijackers to practice using the aircraft's autopilot system, adjusting flight paths, and even performing some basic maneuvers. It wasn't a perfect simulation, but it gave them enough knowledge to operate the planes during their hijackings. These hijackers didn't need to master every aspect of flying. X-1000B. They didn't need to land the plane, navigate across continents, or manage passenger comfort. Their goal was simple: take control of the plane, overpower the flight crew, and steer the aircraft toward its deadly destination. X-1000B. Once they gained control of the cockpit, they didn't need to do much more than fly the plane in a straight line and adjust the autopilot to keep it on course. X-1000B. This minimal understanding of aviation was enough to carry out their deadly mission. What's chilling is how easily they were able to adapt. X-1000B. They learned quickly and efficiently, using their training to control the planes, even if they didn't fully understand every aspect of aviation. They didn't need to be seasoned pilots. They just needed the resolve to hijack the planes and carry out their plans. The hijackers' training wasn't flawless, and it was far from the skill set required for professional pilots. X-1000B. But that was never their goal. They didn't need precision flying or technical expertise. They only needed to gain control and get the plane to its target. And that's exactly what they did. In the end, their ability to overpower the flight crews and take control of the planes was what made this attack so effective. X-1000B. While the hijackers weren't aviation experts, they didn't need to be. They used the tools at their disposal, flight simulators and basic training, to carry out one of the most catastrophic events in history. The morning of September 11, 2001, revealed just how unprepared the aviation industry was to confront the threat of terrorism. Prior to that day, air travel was considered one of the safest modes of transportation, and airport security procedures, while present, were relatively lax in comparison to today's standards. Airport security in 2001 focused primarily on screening passengers for illegal items like weapons or drugs, but it was not designed to detect the more sophisticated threats posed by terrorists. While there were metal detectors and X-ray machines, they were intended to catch everyday contraband. They did not screen for the possibility that a terrorist might carry something seemingly harmless, like a box cutter or a small knife, that could be used to hijack an airplane. Security at the checkpoints was generally brief and non-invasive. Passengers typically waited in line for a short time before passing through security. Even if someone did seem suspicious, there were no mechanisms in place to dig deeper. Behavioral analysis and psychological profiling were not part of the process. Security personnel had no formal training in identifying potential terrorists. Their job was primarily to look for weapons and explosives, not to stop someone from commandeering a plane. A major issue that led to the attacks was the lack of secure cockpit doors. Pilots did not have reinforced bulletproof doors separating them from the passengers, something that would now seem like a basic necessity. In fact, many cockpit doors were easily unlocked, and there was no standard protocol for securing the cockpit during flight. X-1000B. In 2001, there was a belief that such precautions were unnecessary because hijackers had historically sought to land the plane and negotiate for ransom or political demands. The idea of hijackers flying planes into buildings was almost unthinkable. The flight crews were also poorly trained for the kind of hijacking that occurred. Pilots were taught to comply with hijackers' demands in the event of an attempted takeover, expecting that they could land the plane and resolve the situation without violence. They were not trained to fight back or deal with a situation where passengers could be used as human shields, or when terrorists had plans for mass destruction. Passengers also had very little idea of how to handle such a scenario. Prior to 9/11, there were few, if any, briefings on what to do in the event of a hijacking. Airliners were typically not equipped with the kind of emergency safety protocols that would become standard after the attacks. In fact, many of the passengers on 9/11 were caught completely off guard, unsure of how to respond when they realized their plane was being hijacked and used as a weapon. Another critical factor was the lack of advanced screening technology. The TSA had not yet been established, and airport security systems were based on technology from the 1980s. X-ray machines were not as sophisticated as they are today, and there was little effort to screen for explosives or other dangerous materials. The hijackers exploited these gaps, carrying minimal weapons, simple box cutters, which were enough to overpower the crew and hijack the planes. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the aviation security failures was the miscommunication between agencies. The CIA, FBI, and other intelligence agencies were tracking potential terrorists, but the information was not always shared effectively between agencies. The hijackers, some of whom had been flagged in intelligence reports, managed to board the planes without much trouble. In fact, one of the hijackers was even on the FBI's radar weeks before the attack, but the lack of a coordinated response allowed the plan to unfold without intervention. The terrorist plot was able to unfold because the system was reactive rather than proactive. Even after the hijackings began, the airlines, the FAA, and law enforcement agencies failed to act quickly enough. In fact, many of the hijackers' movements were not recognized as a serious threat until it was too late. There was no standardized procedure for responding to a hijacking that involved flying a plane into a target. The aviation system had not anticipated such an extreme attack. The hijackers themselves took advantage of these security lapses. They passed through security checkpoints without raising suspicions. They were carrying small, harmless-looking objects, box cutters, which could be easily concealed and weren't considered dangerous by security standards. At the time, the idea of someone using a knife to hijack a plane seemed improbable. The hijackers were able to use these everyday tools to overpower the crew and take control of the aircraft. The lax security measures in place before 9/11 were the result of complacency and outdated procedures. There was little thought given to the evolving nature of terrorism. Security measures had not kept up with the new threats that were emerging, and aviation authorities had not fully grasped the danger posed by well-organized terrorist cells. X-1000B. This failure to evolve led to an aviation security system that was completely unprepared to handle the unprecedented attack on 9/11. Why didn't aviation security work? X-1000B. It simply wasn't designed to deal with the new reality of terrorist hijackings for suicide missions. The aviation system in 2001 was based on outdated assumptions about what hijackers wanted: negotiations and ransom, not mass murder. When the hijackers carried out their plan, it exposed the massive vulnerabilities in the system and set the stage for the sweeping changes that would follow. When the first hijacked flight, American Airlines Flight 11, took off from Boston at 7:59 a.m., there was no immediate indication that anything was wrong. The routine morning of air traffic control quickly turned into a nightmare, and the early response by air traffic controllers was filled with confusion and uncertainty. As Flight 11 veered off its planned course and made a sharp turn towards New York City, Air traffic controllers quickly realized that something was wrong. But even though the hijacking was confirmed, there was no immediate protocol to respond to such an extreme situation. Air traffic control had little experience with dealing with a hijacking that involved flying a plane into a target. The first signs of a hijacking began at 8:14 a.m. when the aircraft's transponder was turned off, making it difficult for controllers to track the flight. The controller tried to reach the plane, but there was no response. This was the moment when the magnitude of the threat started to sink in. However, it wasn't until 8:20 a.m. that the FAA officially notified NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, of the hijacking. The lack of coordination between agencies such as the FAA, NORAD, and the military resulted in confusion, miscommunication, and delays in the response. As the hijackers were successfully carrying out their plans, the U.S. defense system was struggling to get its bearings and mobilize an appropriate response. Military fighters that could have intercepted the planes were scattered across the country, and there was no clear chain of command for how to respond to the unfolding crisis. The delay in intercepting the planes on 9/11 became one of the most significant criticisms of the U.S. response. But it also revealed a critical vulnerability in the nation's defense system. There was no protocol for an attack of this nature, and no one knew how to stop it once it was already in progress. As the day unfolded, the world watched as each hijacked flight was used as a weapon, and the confusion at NORAD and within the FAA only deepened the sense of helplessness. The failure to react in time has remained one of the most poignant lessons learned from 9/11, leading to massive reforms in air defense and aviation security in the years to come. Could the 9/11 attacks have been prevented? A haunting question that has followed the attacks ever since. With each passing year, more information about the missed opportunities, failure to act, and broken communication between intelligence agencies has come to light. The events of September 11, 2001 did not come out of nowhere. There were signs, red flags, that, if noticed and acted upon in time, might have prevented the disaster. However, the failure to connect these dots between the CIA, the FBI, the FAA, and international intelligence led to a catastrophic failure of coordination. In the months leading up to 9/11, there were multiple pieces of intelligence that, when pieced together, could have painted a clear picture of an impending attack. But at the time, the information was fragmented and often misunderstood or ignored. The CIA had intercepted communication indicating that a major attack was being planned by Al-Qaeda. The agency even knew that Mohammed Atta and other key hijackers were in the U.S., and yet they failed to inform the FBI about the possible threat. In fact, it wasn't until after the attacks that the CIA admitted that they had collected information about the hijackers that should have been shared with the FBI. This was a critical mistake. At this point, NORAD should have been notified earlier to scramble military interceptors to deal with the threat. But the FAA's delay in contacting NORAD created a significant gap in the response time. NORAD was supposed to be the first line of defense in cases of airspace incursions, but in this case, they weren't notified until the hijacking was well underway. NORAD was tasked with intercepting and responding to potential threats in U.S. airspace, but it wasn't fully prepared to deal with a situation of this magnitude. When the FAA did notify NORAD, it was too late for the interceptors to get in the air in time to stop the planes before they crashed. The air defense system was designed for situations where the enemy was an external threat, not one coming from within the country itself. The scramble to get interceptors airborne was filled with delays. At 8:40 a.m., NORAD received word about the hijacking of United Airlines Flight 175, which was heading for the World Trade Center. But NORAD's fighters were still on the ground, and it would take time to get them into the air. At this point, the planes were on a trajectory toward their targets, and the military was unable to respond quickly enough to prevent the inevitable. The situation became even more complicated when the third hijacked flight, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. By this time, NORAD had scrambled planes, but they were too far away to intercept the planes in time. Another significant delay occurred with the fourth hijacked flight, United Airlines Flight 93. This plane was headed towards Washington, D.C., but the passengers on board fought back, ultimately preventing the hijackers from reaching their target. However, despite the heroism of the passengers, the lack of available interceptors meant that the plane could not be stopped in time. It crashed into a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m., long after it could have been intercepted. The delay in launching interceptors was not due to a lack of effort or resources. Rather, it was the result of systemic failures in communication, coordination, and preparedness. The air defense system had never been tested in a real-world scenario of hijackings being used as weapons. The FAA was not in direct communication with NORAD during the critical moments of the attacks, and there was no established protocol for how to handle such a situation. The lack of coordination between agencies such as the FAA, NORAD, and the military resulted in confusion, miscommunication, and delays in the response. As the hijackers were successfully carrying out their plans, the U.S. defense system was struggling to get its bearings and mobilize an appropriate response. Military fighters that could have intercepted the planes were scattered across the country, and there was no clear chain of command for how to respond to the unfolding crisis. The delay in intercepting the planes on 9/11 became one of the most significant criticisms of the U.S. response. But it also revealed a critical vulnerability in the nation's defense system. There was no protocol for an attack of this nature, and no one knew how to stop it once it was already in progress. As the day unfolded, the world watched as each hijacked flight was used as a weapon, and the confusion at NORAD and within the FAA only deepened the sense of helplessness. The failure to react in time has remained one of the most poignant lessons learned from 9/11, leading to massive reforms in air defense and aviation security in the years to come. The attacks of September 11, 2001, didn't just leave a scar on the heart of America. They transformed the very way the world approached air travel. Flying, which was once considered a relatively routine experience, often even glamorous, became a highly scrutinized, security-centric ordeal. A new era of aviation security was born overnight, and it forever changed the landscape of air travel for both passengers and airline staff. The rise of the TSA was one of the most immediate responses to 9/11. The Transportation Security Administration was established in November 2001 to oversee the security of U.S. air travel. What once was the responsibility of individual airlines with varying levels of effectiveness was now placed under one centralized agency. The TSA was given the authority to set strict security protocols at all airports, requiring passengers to undergo thorough screening, including X-ray scanning of luggage and metal detectors to identify potential threats. Prior to 9/11, airport security was relatively light. Passengers were allowed to bring more items on board, including liquids and even small knives, without triggering alarms. However, in the aftermath of the attacks, these policies were overhauled. Laptops, bottles of water, and even small amounts of liquids were banned from carry-on luggage. What we now consider to be basic security procedures, taking off shoes, having bags scanned, and being patted down, were all introduced in response to the tragic events. Could the 9/11 attacks have been prevented? A haunting question that has followed the attacks ever since. With each passing year, more information about the missed opportunities, failure to act, and broken communication between intelligence agencies has come to light. The events of September 11, 2001 did not come out of nowhere. There were signs, red flags, that if noticed and acted upon in time, might have prevented the disaster. However, the failure to connect these dots between the CIA, the FBI, the FAA, and international intelligence led to a catastrophic failure of coordination. In the months leading up to 9/11, there were multiple pieces of intelligence that, when pieced together, could have painted a clear picture of an impending attack. But at the time, the information was fragmented and often misunderstood or ignored. The CIA had intercepted communication indicating that a major attack was being planned by Al-Qaeda. The agency even knew that Mohammed Atta and other key hijackers were in the US, and yet they failed to inform the FBI about the possible threat. In fact, it wasn't until after the attacks that the CIA admitted that they had collected information about the hijackers that should have been shared with the FBI. The FBI, for its part, had identified some of the hijackers as potential threats, yet no urgent action was taken. One of the most glaring examples was Zacarias Moussaoui, a man who was studying aviation in Minnesota. In August 2001, Moussaoui was arrested after suspicious behavior during flight training. The FBI agents in Minnesota had serious concerns that he might be planning something sinister, but there was insufficient urgency from headquarters to pursue the case further. In hindsight, it seems clear that if Moussaoui had been fully investigated, the hijackers could have been stopped before they boarded their flights. While Moussaoui's case was one example, there were other warning signs as well. Al-Qaeda had been active in plotting major attacks throughout the 1990s, and by 2001, U.S. intelligence had knowledge of terrorist cells operating in the U.S. The problem was that terrorism was still not fully understood as the clear and present threat that it was. U.S. agencies were still largely focused on traditional espionage and Cold War tactics, not on the new emerging threat of asymmetric warfare from groups like Al-Qaeda. In addition, flight schools in the U.S. had records showing that some of the hijackers had enrolled in flight training programs. However, there was no centralized system for sharing that information with the FBI or CIA. The FAA, which was responsible for regulating flight schools and pilot training, also failed to flag the suspicious behavior of some of the hijackers who were seeking flight training. Mohammed Atta, the leader of the hijackers, had been taking lessons at a flight school in Florida, but there was no coordinated effort to track his activities or to link his flight training to the possibility of an attack. Beyond the intelligence failures, another major issue was the lack of communication between federal agencies and international intelligence services. U.S. intelligence agencies were receiving warnings from foreign intelligence agencies about terrorist activities in the U.S. and potential threats. For example, intelligence from the German government in July 2001 highlighted the presence of suspected Al-Qaeda operatives in the U.S., but that information was not shared promptly with the FBI or other relevant agencies. The lack of coordination between intelligence agencies was a major factor in the failure to prevent the attack. There was no single, cohesive national security apparatus in place to track and respond to the growing threat. Each agency operated in isolation, and there was no unified response to the growing warnings of a potential attack. Information from overseas partners, such as European intelligence agencies, was often disregarded or lost in bureaucratic red tape. There was also a lack of urgency and institutional resistance to fully investigating potential threats. Agencies like the FBI had the necessary information to launch investigations, but there was no comprehensive mandate to follow through. In fact, the FBI's counterterrorism efforts were often undermined by political resistance and bureaucratic hurdles that stifled quick action. Many agents within the FBI were frustrated with the lack of cooperation from other agencies, particularly the CIA. Another crucial aspect was the lack of a centralized database where intelligence could be cross-referenced. With so many pieces of information spread across different agencies, there was no single point of contact for pulling everything together. The lack of integration between intelligence services made it almost impossible to see the full picture in real time. Despite all the missed opportunities, it's important to acknowledge that 9/11 was an unprecedented attack. Even with the intelligence gathered, it's unclear whether the US government could have fully understood the nature of the threat or acted fast enough to stop the hijackers. The sheer audacity of the plot and the terrorists' ability to exploit gaps in security made it a difficult target for early intervention. However, one thing is clear. The breakdowns in communication, coordination, and information sharing played a pivotal role in the success of the attack. If these issues had been addressed earlier, there is a possibility, albeit uncertain, that the attack could have been prevented. But with the complexities of international terrorism and the evolving threat landscape, it's hard to say with certainty whether the events of September 11th could have been avoided. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, didn't just leave a scar on the heart of America. They transformed the very way the world approached air travel. Flying, which was once considered a relatively routine experience, often even glamorous, became a highly scrutinized, security-centric ordeal. A new era of aviation security was born overnight, and it forever changed the landscape of air travel for both passengers and airline staff. The rise of the TSA was one of the most immediate responses to 9/11. The Transportation Security Administration was established in November 2001 to oversee the security of U.S. air travel. What once was the responsibility of individual airlines, with varying levels of effectiveness, was now placed under one centralized agency. The TSA was given the authority to set strict security protocols at all airports, requiring passengers to undergo thorough screening, including X-ray scanning of luggage and metal detectors to identify potential threats. Prior to 9/11, airport security was relatively light. Passengers were allowed to bring more items on board, including liquids and even small knives, without triggering alarms. However, in the aftermath of the attacks, these policies were overhauled. Laptops, bottles of water, and even small amounts of liquids were banned from carry-on luggage. What we now consider to be basic security procedures, taking off shoes, having bags scanned, and being patted down, were all introduced in response to the tragic events. But the changes didn't stop there. The cockpit doors, once easy to breach, were suddenly reinforced with bulletproof materials. Locking mechanisms were installed to prevent anyone from gaining access to the flight deck. The idea was clear. Never again would hijackers be able to take control of an aircraft as they had on 9/11. The tragic events of that day taught the aviation world that the cockpit must remain a fortress, a safe haven where pilots could defend the flight and passengers from further attacks. Flight crews were also trained to handle potential hijackings, with emergency protocols in place for situations involving rogue passengers or threats to the aircraft. No-fly lists became another major security feature post-9/11. These lists contain the names of individuals deemed to be threats to national security, preventing them from boarding flights in the first place. While this measure aimed to stop known terrorists from reaching their targets, it also led to a rise in controversial detentions. Many people found themselves mistakenly flagged and detained due to errors in the system, leading to discussions about the balance between national security and civil liberties. The creation of air marshals also marked a significant shift in aviation security. These highly trained officers, disguised as regular passengers, were deployed on flights to protect against potential hijackings. Their presence, although covert, acted as a deterrent to anyone considering a hijacking attempt. In the years following 9/11, the number of air marshals on flights increased significantly, making passengers feel somewhat more secure. But it also raised questions about the extent to which the government could go to safeguard air travel. Airport security became invasive, often uncomfortable, but undeniably necessary. The days of leisurely waiting for a flight, sipping coffee and reading a magazine, were replaced with long lines, body scans, and the constant reminder that a threat could be lurking. For many travelers, this marked the beginning of an era of constant vigilance, where every action was scrutinized and every passenger was treated as a potential threat. Beyond the physical changes, 9/11 also changed the culture of flying. Airports, once welcoming and open spaces, became fortresses with high security checks, barricades, and restrictions. The freedom to roam around terminals, relax in lounges, and move freely through gates evaporated, replaced with a sense of increased surveillance and suspicion. The emotional toll on passengers, from the sense of fear to the frustration of longer wait times, became part of the new normal. Flying was no longer an easy or carefree experience. This shift also impacted the airline industry itself. Airlines began investing heavily in security technologies, including advanced scanning machines and biometric identification systems. The focus was no longer on the speed or convenience of air travel, but on ensuring passenger safety above all else. Airliners also began to update their emergency protocols, working closely with the TSA and international authorities to prevent further terrorist incidents. The introduction of body scanners in airports to detect concealed weapons, along with tighter scrutiny of carry-on bags and personal items, became a routine part of the boarding process. International airports followed suit, implementing similar security measures that would, in time, become standard across the globe. But while these changes made air travel safer, they also raised questions about the effectiveness of the measures taken. Is it possible to truly safeguard an entire system where the volume of travelers is so vast and the opportunities for creative terrorist tactics are endless? The world had witnessed firsthand how an attack could be carried out using ordinary objects. And now, security measures were designed to make sure that nothing ordinary could be used against passengers and crews. The long-term impacts of 9/11 on aviation are still felt today. The journey from the security line to boarding the aircraft is far from the seamless process it once was. And while air travel may have become more secure, it has also become far less convenient and far more stressful. For many, the question remains, are we truly safer now, or have we simply adapted to a new normal? The September 11th attacks were more than just a tragedy. They were a global turning point that reshaped not only the way we view aviation, but also how we understand security, freedom, and the very idea of trust. The catastrophic events of that fateful morning sent shockwaves through every aspect of life, from politics to culture, to the most fundamental routines of daily existence, including how we travel. So what did we learn from 9/11? The world learned that vulnerability can exist in even the most trusted systems. Air travel, once seen as a safe, reliable way of connecting the world, became a target for terrorist attacks. The aviation industry, once focused on speed and convenience, was forced to refocus its priorities, safety above all else. But the cost of that safety was the very convenience that made flying a pleasurable experience for many. Suddenly, every passenger became a potential threat, every bag a possible dangerous weapon, and every flight a potential disaster waiting to happen. In the aftermath, the aviation world was restructured. TSA took control of airport security, cockpit doors were reinforced, air marshals were deployed, and no-fly lists were established to prevent terrorists from boarding planes. These measures, while necessary, changed the way the world flew. security became the top priority, but with it came the sacrifices of freedom and privacy. Long lines, invasive checks, and an ongoing sense of heightened vigilance became the new normal. However, despite all the security measures put in place, the question remains, are we really safer now? While security in airports has drastically increased, and while we may be better equipped to prevent attacks like the ones that occurred on 9/11, the threat of terrorism continues to evolve. New tactics, new ideologies, and new ways of exploiting weaknesses in the system constantly emerge, leaving security experts and authorities in a perpetual cat-and-mouse game. So while the world may be safer in some ways, we are constantly reminded that no system is ever perfect, and no security measure is ever foolproof. The world of aviation is a different place today, more secure, but also more complex and, in many ways, more stressful. What 9/11 taught us is that nothing should be taken for granted. Not our freedom, not our safety, and certainly not the planes we board. We are living in an era where security has a price, and that price is often measured in the form of inconvenience, delay, and a feeling of suspicion that accompanies every flight. As we reflect on the events of 9/11 and the changes it brought about, it's important to remember the resilience of the human spirit. The aviation industry has risen from the ashes of tragedy, and although air travel may never be the same, it continues to serve as a lifeline that connects us to the world. We have learned hard lessons, but we must continue to evolve, adapting to the new threats and challenges that come our way. So, are we truly safer now? Perhaps, but at what cost? The sky may be safer, but it has also become a reminder of how fragile our safety really is. And as we continue to travel through this world, we must carry with us the lesson that freedom is not free, and security comes with its own set of compromises. The skies may never look the same, but they remain a symbol of human resilience, a place where we can soar, but never forget the lessons we've learned. If you've enjoyed this in-depth look into the changes that 9/11 brought to aviation, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. I've already covered the stories of the Concorde and MH370, and I've got plenty more in store. Don't miss out.